when we did our mindfulness training, our focus was on recognizing distraction and bringing the mind back from a position of distraction. So there it was all about learning to focus. And we have that definition of mindfulness is knowing what is happening while it's happening. Now, as with the definition for insight, the implication in the term, in the defining term, is that there's always something happening. And this you can see for yourself. Your mind is always busy doing something. It's either generating activity inwardly, relating to its own feelings, its own thought processes, or it's responding to external stimuli. So the nature of the mind is to be what we call dynamic, to keep moving. And if we don't have mindfulness, the mind moves and does things without our realizing it. So we could say we're not there, we're not fully present, and this is the nature of distraction. Distraction is when my energy, my mind energy, is fragmented. So that I might be doing something here, thinking of something else, and spilling my tea like everybody does when they walk up and down this corridor here. So that is the non-mindful condition. Apparently when there are mindfulness courses, a lot of mindless things happen at Samueling, more than normal. And I don't personally believe that, but I get blamed for it. So I just thought the mindfulness students might like to know that. So the lack of mindfulness results in fragmentation. Fragmentation results in not knowing what I'm doing while I'm doing it. So it's like only being partially present. So we train in mindfulness to bring the mind more and more into focus in the moment. So that is our definition, knowing what is happening while it's happening. The knowing quality isn't one of working things out. It's not, I know this because I worked it out, I know it because I followed a theory. It's the knowing of direct perception. And this is a characteristic of everything we do within the field of mind training. It is working with direct perception. So it is, the term we use is it's experiential. We're constantly pushing the boundaries of our experience. And this is interesting because it's not as though we're pushing into new areas of experience. As human beings, we are already experiencing a huge amount more than we realize. But because we're not mindful, we're not connected, we don't realize what's happening. But with mindfulness, we push that boundary. So it's as though we become increasingly in touch with the characteristics of the mind state and with the activity of the mind. So that's the dimension of mindfulness training, and that's the one we've been working with over the last
3 years probably?
3 years. So by now you're all very mindful, and we've combined compassion training with that. So the result is you're very compassionately mindful. The reason we combine compassion training with the training of mindfulness is so that when we expose activities to the mind, instead of going into reactive self-attacking or feeling of defeat or depression, whatever, we are able warmly to embrace and accept the totality of our experience. And that's very important because particularly in the Western world, there's a huge tendency among people to reject themselves, to not like themselves, to not like the way they are. And when we start through our mindfulness discovering more about what we are, who we are, what's going on, the tendency is for that not liking to become heightened or maybe even intensified. So we bring in compassion. We recognize we are human beings, we're not perfect. As I was telling you all this morning, we are a lot of neurotic messes, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to be like that. Once we're a little bit stabilized in mindfulness, we can go on to the next stage, which is insight. And we define insight almost the same way. We change one word. Mindfulness is knowing what's happening while it's happening. Insight is recognizing what is happening while it's happening. So now we shift our focus from knowing to recognizing. And this begins to imply a much deeper seeing into the activity of the mind. What I've noticed is that people who only do mindfulness can skid along the surface of the mind. Not everybody, of course, but it's quite possible to achieve a certain level of calm, and that's what most people want. The mind can become calm, it can become quite peaceful, we can feel nice, and we can just stay there and drift along like that, not really learning anything. I remember once Akon Rinpoche was giving us a lecture about this, about how we can experience this sort of peaceful state and get stuck there. And he said he knew somebody who'd gone to a monastery somewhere up in a Burmese jungle, and there were all these monks. They were wonderful monks. They'd been practicing there for years and years, and they had all this mindfulness, and they were very peaceful. But apparently, that's as far as they got. They weren't becoming enlightened, they weren't developing insight. And they were all happy little smiley monks, and they got old and they had wrinkled faces. So the term had gone around that they were like little old apples. You know, if you store an apple in the winter, it just gets more and more wrinkled and smiley. And that was about all. So you can become a little old apple. And that's great, you know, it means you have a peaceful life, but you don't get anywhere. So mindfulness on its own, I've discovered, doesn't necessarily lead to insight. And insight is the key to liberation, the key to freeing the mind. So now we have to ask, what is the mind, what is the state of the mind that is not free? The not free mind is the mind that's locked into delusion. Now, of course, the beginning of the delusion is buying into the idea that there is a separate egocentric identity here. But that's going a bit far for you at the moment. We lock into delusions all along the way. If you look at your mind, what you'll notice is that any moment you have a set of ideas about yourself, about your life, about reality around you, about how things are and how things should be. And that perception locks you into being in a particular way in the world. And it cuts you off from what's really going on. You become isolated by your way of viewing things. And the most important area of isolation is the way you view yourself. Do you realize that at this very moment, you are sitting here with a self-perception? Would any of you care to reflect on your self-perception at this moment? And if it's not too embarrassing, would you care to share it? What walks into this room is a self-perception. This is me. I'm walking into this room. I'm going to attend a lecture. I might stay awake through the lecture, but if I'm lucky, I'll fall asleep. The preferred option. I might understand it, I might not. And more I'm being disturbed to discover people are afraid of me. So this guy, Rob Nairn, might ask me questions. And then he might interrogate me. So your self-perception at any moment might be one that includes a little bit of feeling threatened. Yes? But Pat's never threatened. So self-perception is something we carry around with us. Now, until we focus on it, the chances are we don't realize it's there. We don't realize we have a perception ourselves. Have you ever, for example, felt insulted? Yes? Have you felt slighted? What got slighted or insulted? I don't accept vague terms like ego. I want to know exactly what got insulted.
Sense of self.
Sense of self? Your view of yourself. It's this sense of this perception. If I think I'm a big deal, and you don't treat me as a big deal, I feel slighted. If I think I'm... do you know this word ragamuffin? If I think I'm something like that, and you treat me with respect, I'd actually be quite put out. Because it doesn't accord with my self-perception. That people don't treat me that way. So we experience the world in terms of a whole lot of fixed views about ourselves, about others. And these keep us trapped. We are trapped in those. And you could, in fact, be much cleverer than you are. In fact, you probably are. You could be much happier than you are. But you carry ideas. And the trouble is, if you study something like psychology, you get a whole lot of new ideas that can make you miserable. Because you start out thinking, I'm a bit of a misfit. Then you read psychology, and there are a whole lot of definitions of neurosis. And you start reading those definitions, and you suddenly realize you fit all of them. So you're not only neurotic according to Jung, or Freud, or Maslow, you're neurotic according to all of them, plus a few others that haven't yet been thought of. So now, of course, you add to your neurosis this self-attacking, self-pity, disaster mentality. I am this walking catastrophe. So we're constantly doing this to ourselves. And it's all conceptualization. It's all forming ideas and then converting those ideas into reality. So now you see, 20 years ago, I studied Carl Jung a lot. In fact, it was more than that. And the thing that fascinated me most about Jung was his description of complexes. Complexes are wonderful things. And he uses magnificent terminology like configurations of energy. So when you've got a complex, it's a configuration of energy that causes you to perceive yourself and the world in a fixed way, which probably has one flaw in it that gives you a bad message about yourself, and that defines the whole of you. So I have an inferiority complex, or I have a rejection complex, or something like that. So now I know this, and I go through the world with an added burden. You see, I'm not just an ordinary neurotic Rob Nairn. I'm Rob Nairn with 3 major complexes. And I don't even know how I can carry on functioning with all these complexes. So we gather these ideas about ourselves. Now this is the result of study without insight, where we blindly take on undigested information, apply it to ourselves, and cripple ourselves instead of liberating ourselves. So the unfree mind is the mind that is blindly trapped in ways of thinking about itself. Now, this isn't as easy as it sounds, because thinking happens at 2 distinct levels. And those of you who've been doing the course are very familiar with this. There is coarse thought, and that is the thought that is going through the mind that you are all using at this moment. This thinking, analyzing, intellectual, hopefully rational mind that is absorbing information thinks in a certain way. It thinks in terms of concepts, thinks in terms of ideas. It's doing that right at this moment. Some of it is directed thinking, but the majority of it is involuntary. You're experiencing the arising of a huge amount of thought at any moment. And that's what we've been focusing on yesterday and today. The involuntary appearance of thoughts, and I'm going to focus on that a lot just now. But far more important is at any moment we are also experiencing subtle thought. Subtle thought underlies coarse thought and is more powerful. So what subtle thoughts are you experiencing at this moment? Can any of you recognize subtle thought? Name the categories.
Feelings, feeling tones.
Feeling tones. It's getting there, but not quite. What are the subtle thoughts?
Mood.
Huh?
Your mood. Your underlying mood.
Mood, yeah.
Expectation.
Expectations. Expectation is a subtle thought.
Assumption.
Assumption is a subtle thought. Judgment, yeah, could be. But let's look at assumption and see how an assumption affects your mind, or even an expectation. But assumption is a very, very easy one to identify. Have you ever been in a situation with a person, let's say, where before you met that person, somebody said about them, oh, this person hates you, or this person's got it in for you. Okay, so you then meet them. What is the state of your mind when you meet that person?
Defensive.
You're defensive because you are assuming that at the earliest possible moment they're going to do something bad to you. Now, the chances are you weren't aware of that. The chances are you'll go into that situation and you'll just know it didn't work well. And the chances are as well that you'll blame the other person. But we go through lives trapped in assumptions and then largely driven by expectations. And these are two of the major governing factors of our lives. Assumptions, expectations. They are subtle thoughts. That is, they don't say themselves out loud. They don't present themselves up front. But they're just quietly present, influencing the way we are, molding the way we are. And we don't see them. Therefore, our lives fall into patterns. If I have this expectation assumption combination and I'm neurotic, let's suppose my main neurosis is rejection. You see, I was rejected by my grandmother when I was 2, like that. So I've got built into me this belief that I am the reject. And this is very common. I go through the world making a subtle statement about myself. I am the reject. Then along comes some friendly person who tries to make friends with me. So I reluctantly accept their friendship. But all the time, the message my mind is giving that person is, this is temporary because sooner or later you are going to reject me. And I may never say that. In fact, I won't, because I'm so stupid I don't realize it. So I don't say it. But I'm communicating it all the time. All the time while people are interacting with me, there's this kind of, yes, but. All very well, but. Just you wait. Sooner or later, it's going to be like that. So, we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And our lives then fall into a pattern. We create friendships, or people become friendly with us. We get to a certain point in the friendship, and then somehow it all falls apart. Why? Because I have a rejection neurosis. And the chances are there comes a point where it becomes too painful. I can't wait any longer for you to reject me. So I either reject you or I do something major that forces you to reject me. And I've watched this in people around me a lot. Now this is just a very simple neurosis. It's a very simple, what was the word I was using? Complex. It's a very simple one. Some of our complexes are much more complicated, much more elaborate, and much more difficult to detect. So this is how in life we are trapped. We are trapped by a series of psychological mechanisms like this. And because they are all operating below the surface, at the level of subtle thought, we don't realize they're there. We don't see them working out in ourselves. We don't see our input into our relationships. Being humans, our first resort when things are not working is always to project. That means we attribute the blame for whatever is taking place to other people. We never see ourselves as being the cause of the problem. It's always somebody else's fault. Usually it's this they. They don't understand me, or they don't like me, or they will do this to me sooner or later. Never seeing that actually the action is coming from ourselves. So this is the mind that lacks insight. The mind that doesn't recognize its own activity. The mind that is not free. It's trapped. And it's very interesting if you look around the world. For the last 50 years, the great cry has been freedom. And people focus on political freedom or social freedom or whatever it is. And if you watch those people, I knew quite a lot of them back in where I was born. The most neurotic students were the ones who were most active in some or other freedom activity. And you could see that this external focus was just a symbolic displacement of their own feeling of being trapped, stuck in their own minds. So they put it out there. They joined causes. They became fighters for freedom, whatever it was. But that's not the issue. The issue is their own minds. So, luckily, we aren't engaged in any kind of political revolution, I hope. Instead, we are facing the much more difficult task of transforming our own minds. Because that is where freedom comes about. Mindfulness, compassion is preparation. Insight is the part that really starts changing things. Recognizing what is happening while it's happening. And that requires special training. The training we've been working with is inquiry process. Hifawif, that's this exercise where we find out how we feel about what we're feeling.
Reflection and resting.
Reflection and resting. There are 4 of them. Heather knows the 4, that's why she has to sit